Before the internet, before cell phones, there was a different kind of terror. It was a terror that lived in the yellow glow of your porch light. A terror that looked like your neighbor, or your friend, or the officer patrolling your street. For decades, he was just a whisper, a phantom known only by the state he haunted, the Golden State Killer. But the real horror wasn't his brutality. It was the chilling, simple truth that for years, while investigators chased ghosts, he was sitting right there, quiet, ordinary, and smiling. You're listening to Midnight Crime Story. Dim the lights, lock your doors, and settle in, because tonight, we finally look at the man who was terrifying secrets, hidden in plain sight. The suburban streets of California held their breath in the darkness. Between 1976 and 1986, a predator moved through neighborhoods like a phantom, leaving behind a trail of terror that would haunt an entire state for decades. Tonight, we're going to explore one of the most chilling cases in American criminal history. A case where evil wore a badge, where nightmares became reality, and where the very people sworn to protect became the ones to fear. This is the story of the Golden State Killer, and the terrifying secrets that were hiding in plain sight all along. Before we dive into this haunting tale, I want you to settle in and let the darkness wrap around you. Turn off the lights, maybe put on some headphones, and prepare yourself for a journey into the shadows of human nature. What you're about to hear isn't fiction. Every detail, every moment of terror, every life destroyed actually happened. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the man responsible was walking among us the entire time, hiding behind a uniform and a smile. The year was 1973, and the quiet town of Visalia, California, was about to meet its first real monster. At first, it seemed like nothing more than petty burglary. Someone was breaking into homes, stealing small items, rummaging through personal belongings. The local police dismissed it as typical criminal behavior, probably some teenager looking for quick cash or valuable items to sell. But there was something different about these break-ins, something that made the investigating officers pause and exchange worried glances. The burglar wasn't just stealing, he was learning. He was watching, he was preparing. The intruder would spend hours inside these homes, going through personal items with an almost ritualistic precision. Women's underwear would be found carefully arranged. Family photographs would be moved from their original positions. Personal journals and address books were studied with the dedication of a scholar preparing for the most important exam of his life. The residents of Visalia began to feel an invisible presence in their daily reported seeing lives. Neighbors, a figure in their back night, standing perfectly, high yards at still among the shadows, watching their homes with the patience of a predator studying its prey. Phone calls would come in the middle of the night, with nothing but heavy breathing on the other end. The caller seemed to know intimate details about the families he contacted, details that could only come from someone who had been inside their homes, touching their belongings, learning their routines. What made these crimes particularly terrifying was the level of preparation involved. This wasn't random criminal activity. This was methodical, calculated. The perpetrator would case neighborhoods for weeks, learning the schedules of families, identifying which homes had the most vulnerable occupants, mapping out escape routes with military enforcement began law precision. Local him calling the Visalia Ransacker, though ransom was never the motive. The name stuck, but it hardly captured the psychological terror he inflicted on his victims. He wasn't just taking their belongings. He was taking their sense of security, their ability to feel safe in their own homes, their trust in the world around them. The break-ins escalated in both frequency and boldness. The ransacker would enter homes while families slept upstairs, moving through their living spaces like a ghost. He seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to avoid detection. never leaving fingerprints, rarely disturbing anything enough to wake the sleeping occupants. It was as if he could move through solid matter, existing in the spaces between consciousness and sleep. But then, the pattern changed. Instead of simply burglarizing empty homes, he began entering occupied residences. Families would wake up to find evidence that someone had been in their house while they slept. A door left ajar that had been closed. Food missing from the refrigerator. Personal items moved just enough to be noticeable. The psychological impact was devastating. How do you sleep peacefully when you know someone can enter your home at will, move through your most private spaces, and observe your most vulnerable moments? The terror reached its peak on September 11, 1975, when the Visalia Ransacker encountered journalism professor Claude Snelling outside his home on Whitney Street. Snelling had heard noises and went to investigate, discovering a masked intruder attempting to kidnap his 16-year-old daughter Elizabeth from her bedroom window. When Snelling confronted the man, the intruder shot him twice with a .38 caliber revolver, killing him instantly before disappearing into the night. This was the moment when petty burglary became murder, when a mysterious criminal became a killer, when the stakes became life and death for everyone living in California. The investigation into Claude Snelling's murder revealed disturbing details about the perpetrator's methods. Footprint evidence suggested the killer was a man, athletic young, wearing military-style boots. Witnesses described someone who moved with tactical precision, someone trained in surveillance and evasion techniques. The shooting itself was executed with cold professionalism. 2 quick shots center mass, followed by an immediate tactical retreat. But perhaps most chilling was what investigators discovered about the attempted kidnapping. The perpetrator had been watching the Snelling family for weeks, learning their routines, identifying the daughter's bedroom window, planning the abduction with meticulous attention to detail. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was a carefully orchestrated operation that had been in planning for an extended period. The murder of Claude Snelling marked the end of the Visalia Ransacker's reign of terror in that community, but it was far from the end of his criminal career. Like smoke dissipating in the wind, he simply vanished from Visalia, leaving behind a community forever changed by his presence. Families installed new locks, security systems, and floodlights. Children were no longer allowed to play outside after dark. The simple pleasures of suburban life had been poisoned by the knowledge that evil could be watching from the shadows. What the residents of Visalia didn't know was that their tormentor hadn't disappeared. He had simply moved on to new hunting grounds, and his next target would be an entire metropolitan area, California, in Sacramento. 1976 was a growing city filled with young families pursuing the American dream. Tree-lined suburbs stretched for miles, filled with ranch-style homes where children played in front yards and neighbors knew each other's names. It was exactly the kind of community where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked, where the biggest concern was making sure the lawn was properly maintained and the family car was washed every weekend. But on June 18, 1976, that sense of security was shattered forever when a masked int into a Ruder Broquillo drive home on Pass in Rancho Cordova. What happened that night would establish a pattern of terror that would grip the Sacramento area for the next several years. The attack began like something from every person's worst nightmare. A young couple, both in their early 20s, were awakened in the middle of the night by a bright flashlight shining in their faces. Before they could fully comprehend what was happening, a masked figure was standing over their bed, pointing a gun at their heads. The intruder's voice was calm, controlled, almost conversational. He spoke in whispers, giving detailed instructions about what he expected from his victims. He had brought ligatures with him, lengths of shoelace that he used to bind the male victim, separating him from his female companion with methodical precision. The level of preparation was terrifying. This wasn't spontaneous violence. This was a carefully planned operation. What made this attack particularly horrifying was the psychological torture involved. The perpetrator would spend hours with his victims, altern of violence aiding between periods and almost casual conversation. He would leave room for extended periods, during which the victims could move through and hear him there, eating house their food, rummaging through their belongings, making phone calls. When investigators arrived at the scene the next morning, they found evidence of a crime unlike anything they had encountered before. The level of control demonstrated by the perpetrator was unprecedented. He had managed to subdue 2 adult victims for several hours without alerting neighbors or triggering any security systems. The crime scene showed signs of extensive planning and preparation, but this was just the beginning. Over the next several months, similar attacks occurred throughout the Sacramento area with increasing frequency. The perpetrator, who became known as the East Area Rapist, demonstrated an escalating level of violence and sophistication in his methods. Each attack followed a similar pattern, but with subtle variations that suggested the perpetrator was learning and adapting his techniques. He would study neighborhoods for weeks before striking, learning the routines of potential victims, identifying homes with vulnerable occupants, mapping escape routes with military precision. The psychological profile that emerged from these crimes was deeply disturbing. This was someone who derived pleasure not just from the physical violence, but from the psychological terror he inflicted. He would force victims to lie face down for hours while he moved through their homes, creating an atmosphere of helplessness and fear that extended far beyond the immediate physical assault. Neighborhoods throughout Sacramento began to transform as news of the attacks spread. Hardware stores couldn't keep security systems in stock. Locksmiths worked overtime installing deadbolts and reinforced door frames. Dog adoptions increased dramatically as families sought 4-legged security systems to alert them to potential intruders. But despite all these precautions, the attacks continued. The perpetrator seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to identify and exploit vulnerabilities in home security. Defeat, Hika locks, disable alarm systems, and move through heavily fortified homes as if the security measures didn't exist. What made the situation even more terrifying was the perpetrator's apparent familiarity with police procedures and investigation techniques. He seemed to know exactly how to avoid leaving forensic evidence, how to choose locations that would minimize the chance of being out of time observed, and his attacks to avoid police patrols. Investigators began to suspect they were dealing with someone who had law enforcement or military training. The tactical precision of the attacks, the sophisticated surveillance methods, and the ability to evade capture despite an intensive manhunt all suggested someone with professional-level training in criminal investigation and tactical operations. This suspicion became even stronger when investigators realized the perpetrator was apparently monitoring police radio frequencies. He seemed to know when patrol units were in his target areas, adjusting his activities to avoid contact with law enforcement. On several occasions, patrol officers reported seeing suspicious individuals who disappeared before they could be questioned, as if they had advance warning of police presence. The investigation became one of the largest manhunts in California history, involving multiple law enforcement agencies and thousands of investigative hours. But despite the massive resources devoted the East to catching area rapist, he continued to operate with impunity, striking at will throughout the Sacramento metropolitan area. The East Area Rapist had turned the Sacramento suburbs into a hunting ground, and every shadow held the potential for terror. But what investigators didn't realize was that their quarry possessed advantages that went far beyond criminal cunning. He had access to information that should have been impossible for a civilian to obtain. Police reports began to reveal a disturbing pattern. The perpetrators seemed to know which homes had been recently burglarized by other criminals, targeting these same residences with the knowledge that the victims would be psychologically vulnerable and security conscious. He knew which neighborhoods were scheduled for increased patrol coverage, avoiding these areas with precision timing that suggested access to internal law enforcement communications. Most unsettling of all, he appeared to have detailed knowledge of ongoing investigations. Witnesses who provided detailed descriptions to police would receive anonymous phone calls within days, calls that suggested the caller knew exactly what information had been shared with investigators. The voice was always calm, controlled, delivering veiled threats that made it clear the witness was being watched. Detective Larry Crompton, one of the lead investigators on the case, would later describe the chilling realization that their suspect might be someone with intimate knowledge of police procedures. He knew how WED, Crompton recalled, worked. He knew our response times, our investigation methods, our evidence collection procedures. It was like he was always one step ahead because he knew exactly what moves we were going to make. The attacks themselves began to show an evolution in technique that suggested professional training. The perpetrator used military-style terminology when giving commands to his he-move victims through homes with tactical precision, checking corners and maintaining sight lines like someone trained in room-clearing procedures. His ability to subdue multiple victims simultaneously suggested combat experience or law-specialized enforcement training. But perhaps most disturbing was his apparent knowledge of forensic science. He went to extraordinary lengths to avoid leaving evidence, using techniques that suggested familiarity with crime scene investigation procedures. He would force victims to shower after attacks, destroying potential DNA evidence. He wore gloves and covered shoes to avoid fingerprints and footprint evidence. He even brought towels to wipe down surfaces he might have touched. The psychological warfare continued between attacks. Victims would receive phone calls weeks or months after their assaults, calls that demonstrated the perpetrators' continued surveillance of their lives. He knew when they had moved to new addresses, when they had changed phone numbers, when they had installed new security systems. The message was clear. There was no escape from his attention. These phone calls revealed another chilling aspect of the perpetrator's psychology. His voice would change during conversations, shifting from whispered threats to normal conversational tones, sometimes even adopting different accents or speech patterns. It was as if multiple personalities existed within the same individual, each one carefully crafted to maximize psychological impact. The terror wasn't limited to direct victims. Entire neighborhoods lived in constant fear, transforming the Sacramento suburbs into armed camps. Hardware stores reported unprecedented sales of security equipment. Gun sales skyrocketed as residents armed themselves against an enemy who seemed capable of defeating any defensive measure. Children were no longer allowed to play outside unsupervised, and families developed elaborate security protocols for simple activities like walking to the mailbox. Local hospitals reported a significant increase in anxiety-related disorders and sleep disturbances. Therapists described treating patients who had never been directly victimized but were suffering from severe trauma simply from living in the affected areas. The East Area Rapist wasn't just attacking individuals. He was terrorizing an entire community. The investigation consumed massive resources, with dozens of detectives working the case full-time. Task forces were formed, bringing together investigators from multiple agencies. The FBI became involved, providing behavioral analysis and additional investigative resources. Despite this unprecedented law enforcement response, the attacks continued with clockwork regularity. What investigators couldn't have known was that their suspect had access to information about their investigation in real time. He knew which leads were pursuing, which witnesses they considered most credible, which physical evidence they had collected. This knowledge allowed him to stay ahead of the investigation, adjusting his methods to counter their efforts. The perpetrator's surveillance of his victims extended far beyond the immediate crimes. He would watch families for weeks, learning their routines with obsessive attention to detail. He knew when children had sleepovers, when spouses traveled for business, when elderly relatives visited. This information allowed him to strike when victims were most vulnerable and least likely to receive immediate assistance. The level of preparation involved in each attack was staggering. Crime scene analysis revealed that the perpetrator often entered homes multiple times before committing assaults, familiarizing himself with layouts, disabling security measures, and prepositioning ligatures and other materials he would need during the actual attack. He was methodical, patient, and utterly ruthless in his planning. As 1977 progressed, the attacks became more frequent and more violent each successful assault, and his methods. The perpetrator's confidence grew, which became increasingly sophisticated. He began targeting homes with multiple potential victims, demonstrating an ability to control situations involving complex several people simultaneously. The psychological torture intensified as well. The perpetrator would spend hours in victims' homes, eating their food, going through their personal belongings, making phone calls to unknown to derive as parties. He seemed of much pleasure from this violation privacy, as frumolts themselves the physical ass. Victims reported that the sense of having their personal space contaminated was almost as traumatic as the violence itself. But the most chilling development was the perpetrator's apparent enjoyment of the media attention his crimes were receiving. Newspaper articles about the East Area Rapist seemed to encourage rather than deter him. Attack patterns suggested he was deliberately trying to maximize media coverage, choosing high-profile neighborhoods and timing attacks to coincide with periods of intense public interest. The investigation revealed that the perpetrator was collecting newspaper clippings about his crimes. Several victims reported seeing cutout articles during their assaults, as if the perpetrator was proud of his media coverage and wanted his victims to know how notorious he had become. This suggested a level of narcissism and attention-seeking behavior that would crucially become to understanding his psychology. By late 1977, the East Area Rapist had committed over 30 attacks in the Sacramento area alone. The investigation had generated thousands of tips, hundreds of potential suspects, and dozens of false arrests. Yet the perpetrator remained as elusive as ever, continuing to operate with apparent impunity despite one of the most intensive manhunts in California history. What made the situation even more frustrating for investigators was the quality of the evidence they were collecting. They had detailed physical descriptions, composite sketches, even recordings of the perpetrator's voice from phone calls to victims. Yet, none of this information led to an arrest. It was as if they were hunting a ghost who could appear and disappear at will. The breakthrough that investigators desperately needed would not come from traditional police work. Instead, it from an would emerge unexpected source: the perpetrator's own arrogance and his compulsive need to escalate his crimes. The East Area Rapist was about to make a decision that would eventually lead to his downfall, though it would take decades for the consequences to unfold. In late 1977, something changed in the perpetrator's behavior. The attacks in Sacramento began to decrease in frequency, leading investigators to hope that their suspect had either been arrested for other crimes, moved away from the area, or possibly even died. What they didn't realize was that the East Area Rapist hadn't stopped his criminal activity. He had simply moved to new hunting grounds where his methods could evolve into something even more terrifying. The communities of Southern California were about to discover that their quiet suburban neighborhoods could become the stage for horrors that exceeded even the Sacramento attacks. The man who had terrorized Northern California was preparing to unleash a new level of violence that would earn him an even more terrifying nickname: the original Night Stalker. But first, he would take a brief detour through the Central Valley, where the town of Modesto would experience a taste of the terror that had gripped Sacramento. On December 2nd, 1977, a young couple was attacked in their home using methods identical to those employed by the East Area Rapist. The assault bore all the hallmarks of the Sacramento attacks: extensive pre-crime surveillance, sophisticated entry techniques, psychological torture, and meticulous evidence avoidance. The Modesto attack seemed to serve as a testing ground for new techniques the perpetrator was developing. He spent even more time in the victim's home, going through their belongings with obsessive thoroughness. He made multiple phone calls during the assault, though the recipients of these calls remained unknown. Most disturbing of all, he seemed to be practicing new methods of psychological manipulation that would become signature elements of his future crimes. What investigators didn't realize was that this single attack in Modesto represented a crucial transition point in the perpetrator's criminal evolution. He was moving from being primarily a rapist to becoming something much more dangerous. A killer who derived pleasure not just from sexual violence, but from the ultimate expression of power over his victims. The techniques perfected during the Sacramento attacks and tested in Modesto would soon be deployed in Southern California, where the perpetrator would begin a new chapter of his criminal career. The communities of Ventura, Orange, and Los Angeles counties were about to experience terror, a scale that would make the Sacramento attacks seem almost restrained by comparison. The man, who had spent years perfecting his methods as the East Area Rapist, was preparing to become the original Night Stalker, a predator whose crimes would be in terror so brutalifying that they would haunt Southern California for decades. The evolution from rapist to killer was complete, and the most horrific phase of his criminal career was about to begin. Southern California in 1979 represented everything that embodied the American dream. Sprawling suburbs filled with young families, perfect lawns, and the promise of endless possibilities under the perpetual sunshine. From Ventura County down through Orange County, communities had grown rapidly throughout the 1970s, attracting people who wanted to escape the urban problems of Los Angeles while still enjoying the benefits of California's booming economy. These communities felt safe. Crime was generally limited to petty theft and occasional domestic disputes. Neighborhoods were filled children who played outside it with families who knew each other until darkness fell, and a general sense that serious violent crime was something that happened in other places to other people. That sense of security was about to be shattered in the most violent way possible. On December 30th, 1979, in Goleta, a quiet near Community Santa Barbara, Robert Offerman and Deborah Manning were spending a peaceful evening at Offerman's condominium on Avenida Pequena. Offerman was a respected orthopedic surgeon, 44 years old, who had dedicated his life to helping others. Manning was a 35-year-old psychologist who worked with troubled adolescents. They were both highly educated professionals who had chosen to live in Goleta specifically because of its reputation as a safe, family-oriented community. What happened to them that night would mark the beginning of a new chapter of terror that would grip Southern California for the next several years. The perpetrator who entered their home was the same man who had terrorized Sacramento as the East Area Rapist, but his methods had evolved into something far more deadly. He no longer seemed satisfied with assault and psychological torture. He had developed a taste for the ultimate expression of power: murder. The crime scene revealed a level of violence that shocked even experienced homicide investigators. Both victims had been bound and shot execution style with a .38 caliber weapon. The positioning of the bodies and the evidence at the scene suggested that the perpetrator had spent considerable time in the condominium, going through their belongings, eating their food, and conducting some form of ritualistic behavior before committing the murders. What made this crime-illing was the evidence particularly cache of extensive pre-crime surveillance. Neighbors reported seeing a suspicious individual in the area for several days before the murders, someone who seemed to be studying the condominium complex and the routines of its residents. The perpetrator had clearly identified Offerman and Manning as targets well in advance, watching them, learning their schedules, and planning the attack with meticulous attention to detail. The investigation revealed that the perpetrator had entered the condominium using techniques identical to those employed during the Sacramento attacks. He had defeated security measures with professional-level skill, moved through the residence without alerting neighbors, and avoided leaving forensic evidence despite spending hours at the crime scene. But there was something new in his methodology. The level of violence was unprecedented, suggesting that his psychological needs had evolved beyond sexual assault into murder. The crime scene showed evidence of what behavioral analysts would later describe as signature behaviors. Specific actions that served no practical purpose but fulfilled deep psychological needs in the perpetrator. The murders of Offerman and Manning sent shockwaves through the Goleta community and beyond. Local newspapers struggled to comprehend how such brutal violence could occur in their peaceful suburb. Police departments throughout Southern California began reviewing their unsolved cases, looking for similar patterns that might indicate the presence of a serial killer. What investigators didn't immediately realize was that they were dealing with the same perpetrator who had terrorized Sacramento. The geographic distance and the escalation from sexual assault to murder initially prevented law enforcement agencies from connecting the crimes. Each jurisdiction was dealing with what appeared to be isolated incidents, rather than recognizing the coordinated campaign terror being waged by a single individual. The perpetrator's ability to operate across multiple jurisdictions while avoiding detection was itself evidence of sophisticated criminal knowledge. He seemed to understand exactly how jurisdictional boundaries and communication limitations between law enforcement agencies could be exploited to avoid capture. This suggested not just criminal cunning, but professional-level understanding of police procedures and investigative techniques. The Goleta murders marked the beginning of what would become known as the original Night Stalker series, a collection of crimes that would terrorize Southern California communities for the next several years. The perpetrator had successfully evolved from rapist to killer, and his appetite for violence would only continue to grow. The psychological profile that emerged from the Goleta murders painted a disturbing picture of a predator whose needs had fundamentally shifted. This wasn't the work of someone who had lost control or acted in a moment of passion. Every detail at the crime scene spoke to calculated, methodical planning executed by someone who derived satisfaction from the complete domination of his victims. What investigators couldn't have known at the time was that the perpetrator possessed advantages that went far beyond criminal intelligence. The man stalking Southern California neighborhoods had spent years learning the very techniques that would now be used to hunt him. He understood crime scene investigation procedures because he knew police trained in them, response protocols because he had helped develop them. He could anticipate investigative strategies because he had once been part of the system designed to catch criminals exactly like himself. The investigation into the Offerman-Manning murders revealed forensic evidence that would prove crucial decades later, though its significance wasn't immediately apparent. DNA samples were collected and preserved, though the technology to analyze them effectively wouldn't exist for years. Fingerprint evidence was cataloged, though there were no matches in existing databases. The perpetrator's criminal sophistication had allowed him to avoid leaving obvious clues, but he couldn't eliminate every trace of his presence. As 1980 dawned, Southern California law enforcement agencies began to recognize they were dealing with something unprecedented. The level of violence, the sophisticated methodology, and the apparent randomness of victim selection all pointed to a serial killer unlike any they had encountered before. Task forces were formed, bringing together investigators from multiple jurisdictions to share information and coordinate their efforts. But the perpetrator was already planning his next attack, and his target selection revealed a chilling evolution in his psychological needs. He was no longer satisfied with isolated victims. He wanted to terrorize entire families, to demonstrate his power over multiple people simultaneously, to create crime scenes that would haunt investigators for years to come. On March 13, 1980, in Ventura, a coastal community known for its surfing beaches and Lai Charles, dubback atmosphered Lemonine, and Smith were preparing for bed in their home on High Point Drive. Lyman was a successful attorney, 43 years old, who specialized in personal injury cases. Charlene was 33, an interior decorator who had transformed their home into a showcase of California coastal living. The Smiths represented everything the perpetrator seemed to target: successful, attractive, living in an upscale neighborhood where people felt safe enough to leave windows unlocked and security systems unarmed. They had no reason to believe that evil was watching their home, studying their routines, planning their destruction with the patience of a professional hunter. The attack began in the early morning hours with a level of violence that exceeded even the Goleta murders. Both victims were bound with ligatures that investigators would later recognize as identical years to those used in Sacramento attacks earlier. The perpetrator had brought his materials with him, suggesting particularly horrific and preparation. What made this crime extensive planning before the murders? The perpetrator had spent it torturing was the evidence hours of prolong his victims, alternating between violence and psychological manipulation. He seemed to derive as much pleasure from their terror as from their death scene analysis revealed that he had moved. Crimed through their extended periods, eating home for their food, using their telephone, going through their personal belongings with obsessive thoroughness. The murders themselves were executed with the same cold professionalism that had characterized the Goleta attack. Both victims were shot with a .38 caliber weapon, the same type of firearm used in previous attacks. The positioning of the bodies and the evidence at the scene suggested ritualistic behavior that served no practical purpose beyond fulfilling the perpetrator's psychological needs. Investigators noticed disturbing parallels between the Ventura murders and the unsolved Goleta case. The entry methods were identical, the ligatures matched, and the overall methodology suggested the same perpetrator. But what truly chilled experienced homicide detectives was the evidence of escalation. The level of violence was increasing with each attack, suggesting that the perpetrator's needs were evolving in increasingly dangerous directions. The forensic evidence collected at the Smith residence would prove crucial to the eventual solution of the case, though investigators at the time couldn't have imagined how long it would take for technology to catch up with their needs. DNA samples preserved, finger where carefully prints were cataloged, and detailed crime scene photographs documented every aspect of the attack. But perhaps most importantly, neighbors had observed suspicious activity in the days leading up to the murders. A man had been seen in the area repeatedly, someone who appeared to be conducting surveillance of the neighborhood. He was described as average height, athletic build, wearing casual clothing that allowed him to blend in with the suburban environment. What witnesses couldn't have known was that this individual possessed the training and experience to conduct professional-level surveillance without detection. His ability to observe neighborhoods for weeks without arousing suspicion suggested someone familiar with investigative techniques, someone who understood how to avoid the very methods that would be used to hunt him. The perpetrator's knowledge of police procedures became even more apparent as the investigation progressed. He seemed to know exactly which types of evidence to avoid leaving, which forensic techniques could be defeated, and how to time his attacks to minimize the chances of immediate discovery. This wasn't criminal intuition, This was professional expertise being turned against the very system that had provided the training. Local law enforcement agencies began sharing information more aggressively, recognizing that they were dealing with a serial killer who operated across jurisdictional boundaries. The FBI became more deeply involved, providing behavioral analysis and additional investigative resources. But despite this unprecedented coordination, the attacks continued with terrifying regularity. The perpetrator's psychological profile revealed someone who was organized, methodical, and completely lacking in empathy for his victims. He planned his attacks like military operations, conducting reconnaissance, identifying vulnerabilities, and executing his plans with tactical precision. But underneath this professionalism was something even more disturbing: a deep-seated need to demonstrate complete power over other human beings. The phone calls to victims continued, sometimes occurring months or even years after the original attacks. These calls revealed the perpetrator's continued surveillance of his victims' lives and his desire to maintain psychological control even after the physical violence had ended. The message was always the same. There was no escape from his attention, no safety to be found anywhere. Community impact extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. Entire neighborhoods transformed as news of the attacks spread. Security companies couldn't keep up with demand for alarm systems and reinforced doors. Gun sales skyrocketed as residents armed themselves against a threat that seemed capable of defeating any defensive measure. The psychological toll was immense. Therapists reported treating hundreds of patients who had never been directly victimized but were suffering from severe anxiety and sleep disorders. Children refused to sleep alone. Families developed elaborate security protocols for simple daily activities. The perpetrator wasn't just killing individuals, he was poisoning entire communities with fear. What made the situation even more terrifying was the apparent randomness of victim selection. There seemed to be no pattern that potential victims could use to protect themselves. The perpetrator targeted young couples, older couples, people living alone, families with children, wealth, profession, physical appearance, security measures. Nothing seemed to matter to someone who could defeat any obstacle and terrorize any victim. The investigation revealed that the perpetrator was collecting detailed information about potential victims long before attacking them. He knew their work schedules, their social activities, their family relationships. This level of surveillance required enormous amounts of time and suggested someone whose daily routine allowed for extensive periods of observation and planning. But perhaps most chilling was the evidence that the perpetrator was enjoying the media attention his crimes were receiving. Newspaper coverage seemed to encourage rather than deter him, and attack patterns suggested he was deliberately trying to maximize public fear. He wanted entire communities to know they were being hunted by someone who could strike anywhere, anytime, without warning. By mid-1980, the original Night Stalker had committed multiple double murders throughout Southern California, leaving behind a trail of terror that extended from Ventura County down through Orange County. Each attack demonstrated increasing levels of violence and sophistication, suggesting that the perpetrator's psychological needs were escalating in dangerous directions. The investigation had consumed massive resources and involved some of the most experienced homicide detectives in California. Thousands of tips had been received, hundreds of suspects had been questioned, and dozens of potential matches had been pursued. Yet the perpetrator remained as elusive as ever, continuing to operate with apparent impunity despite one of the most intensive manhunts in state history. What investigators didn't realize was that their quarry possessed advantages that went far beyond criminal cunning. The man they were hunting had once been part of their own ranks, trained in the very techniques now being used to pursue him. He understood their methods because he had once used those same methods to catch criminals. he knew their limitations because he had once worked within those same constraints. The original Night Stalker represented law enforcement's worst nightmare. A predator who combined criminal intent with professional-level training and insider knowledge of police procedures. He was a wolf disguised as a sheepdog, using the very skills and that knowledge to have made him a protector to become one of California's most terrifying predators. But his arrogance would eventually become his downfall. The same confidence that allowed him to operate with impunity for years would also lead him to make mistakes that would eventually expose his true identity. The evidence he left behind, carefully preserved by investigators who never gave up hope, would eventually yield the answers that had eluded them for decades. The breakthrough would come not from traditional police work, but from revolutionary scientific advances that didn't exist when the crimes were committed. DNA technology would eventually evolve to the point where microscopic samples could reveal the most closely guarded secrets. And when that day came, the man who had terrorized California for over a decade would finally face the consequences of his actions. But first, there would be years of silence. Years when the attacks would mysteriously stop, leaving investigators and communities to wonder whether their tormentor had died, been imprisoned for other crimes, or simply moved on to new hunting grounds. The truth was far more sinister. He had simply become better at hiding in plain sight, using his professional position to deflect suspicion while living among the very people he had terrorized. The period, from 1981 to 1986, marked a strange and unsettling chapter in the Golden State Killer investigation. The brutal attacks that had terrorized communities throughout California seemed to have stopped as suddenly as they had begun. The last confirmed original Night Stalker attack occurred on May 4, 1986 in Irvine, when 18-year-old Janelle Cruz was murdered in her family's home while her parents were out of town. The Cruz murder bore all the hallmarks of the previous attacks: sophisticated entry techniques, extensive time spent in the residence, and execution-style killing that demonstrated the perpetrator's complete control over his victim. But then, silence. No more attacks, no more phone calls, no more sightings of suspicious figures conducting neighborhood surveillance. Law enforcement agencies faced a dilemma that would haunt them for decades. Had the perpetrator died, been imprisoned for other crimes, moved to different hunting grounds where his attacks weren't being connected to the California series? Or had he simply become better at avoiding detection, evolving his methods to the point where his crimes no longer followed recognizable patterns? The investigation entered what detectives would later describe as the cold case years, a period when active leads dried up and the case files were relegated to storage boxes in evidence rooms across the state. Task forces were disbanded as resources were redirected to active cases. The media attention that had once kept the story in headlines gradually faded as other crimes captured public attention. But some investigators never gave up. Detective Larry Crompton the East, who had worked East Area Rapist cases in Sacramento, continued to study the evidence and refine his understanding of the perpetrator's psychology. FBI behavioral analysts periodically reviewed the case files, updating their profiles as new techniques were developed. And forensic specialists carefully maintained the DNA evidence that had been collected, waiting for technology to advance to the point where those microscopic samples might finally yield answers. What none of them knew was that the perpetrator hadn't disappeared at all. He had simply become invisible, hiding behind a badge and a uniform in a small police department where no one would think to look for California's most wanted serial killer. Joseph James DeAngelo had joined the Auburn Police Department in 1976, right around the time the East Area Rapist attacks were beginning in Sacramento. His personnel file showed him to be a competent officer with military experience and a clean record. His colleagues described him as quiet, professional, and dedicated to his work. He lived in a modest home with his wife and children, maintaining the appearance of a typical suburban family man. But DeAngelo possessed a secret that would have shocked everyone who knew him. By day, he investigated crimes and protected his community as a sworn law enforcement officer. By night, he became the very type of predator he was supposedly trained to catch. His position in law enforcement provided advantages that would have been impossible for a civilian criminal to obtain. He had access to police radio frequencies, allowing him to monitor patrol patterns and avoid contact with other officers during his criminal activities. He understood evidence collection procedures, enabling him to avoid leaving forensic clues that might lead to his identification. He knew investigative techniques, allowing him to anticipate and counter the very methods being used to hunt him. Most importantly, his badge provided the perfect cover for the extensive surveillance activities that preceded his attacks. A police officer conducting neighborhood patrols could observe potential victims for weeks without arousing suspicion. He could approach homes, talk to residents, and gather intelligence under the guise of community policing activities. DeAngelo's criminal career as the Golden State Killer represented one of the most chilling examples of betrayal in American criminal history. He had taken an oath to serve and protect, then used his position of trust to identify and terrorize the very people he was sworn to defend. The badge that should have been a symbol of safety became a tool for predatory surveillance. His ability to maintain this double life for years spoke to a level of psychological compartmentalization that defied comprehension. During the day, he would respond to emergency calls, investigate crimes, and interact with victims and their families as a caring professional. At night, he would become the source of the very terror he was supposed to prevent. Colleagues would later describe feeling sick when they realized they had worked alongside a serial killer for years without detecting any signs of his true nature. He had attended crime scenes, processed evidence, and participated in investigations, all while secretly being the perpetrator of similar crimes in other jurisdictions. The psychological profile of someone capable of maintaining such a deception revealed disturbing insights into the nature of evil. DeAngelo wasn't a monster who looked the part. He was someone who could blend seamlessly into normal society while harboring the darkest possible impulses. He had a family, friends, professional relationships, and community connections, all while secretly being one of California's most dangerous predators. His law enforcement training also explained many of the sophisticated techniques that had baffled investigators for years. His ability to defeat security systems, avoid forensic detection, and conduct professional-level surveillance all made sense when viewed through the lens of his professional background. He wasn't just a criminal who had learned these skills through trial and error. He was a trained professional applying his expertise in service of evil. The phone calls to victims that had continued for years after attacks took on new significance when viewed in this context. DeAngelo had access to police databases and victim information that would have allowed him to track his victims even after they moved or changed their ident harassment IDs. His surveillance and continue were enabled by resources that should have been used to protect them. Perhaps most disturbing was the realization that DeAngelo had likely used his position to gather intelligence on the very investigations designed to catch him. He would have had access to information about evidence collection, suspect descriptions, and investigative strategies. This insider knowledge allowed him to stay ahead of law enforcement efforts while continuing his criminal activities with apparent impunity. The period from 1986 onwards, when the attacks seemed to stop, likely coincided with DeAngelo's growing awareness that forensic science was advancing in ways that could eventually expose him. DNA analysis was becoming more sophisticated, and evidence preservation techniques were improving. A criminal with his level of professional knowledge would have understood that continuing his activities carried increasing risks of eventual detection. But rather than truly stopping his criminal behavior, DeAngelo may have simply evolved his methods to avoid detection. There were numerous unsolved crimes throughout California during the subsequent years that bore similarities to his known attacks, but lacked the definitive forensic evidence needed to establish connections. His retirement from law enforcement in the 1990s marked another transition point in his criminal career. No longer protected by his badge and the institutional loyalty of his fellow officers, DeAngelo would have needed to be even more careful about avoiding detection. But his years of experience had taught him exactly how to operate below the radar of law enforcement attention. The true scope of DeAngelo's crimes may never be fully known. His access to law enforcement resources, his understanding of investigative techniques, and his ability to operate across multiple jurisdictions while maintaining his cover as a police officer suggest that he may have been responsible for far more violence than has ever been definitively proven. The communities he terrorized had no way of knowing that their tormentor was hiding behind a badge, using his position of trust to facilitate unspeakable crimes. Parents who taught their children to trust police officers had no idea that one of those officers was the very predator they were trying to protect their families from. The betrayal ran even deeper than individual crimes. DeAngelo's actions poisoned the fundamental trust that must exist between law enforcement and the communities they serve. When the people sworn to protect become the source of terror, the social contract that holds civilization together begins to break down. Years passed in silence. The case files grew dusty in evidence rooms across California. Families of victims struggled to find closure without answers. Communities slowly began to heal, though the scars left by the Golden State Killer's reign of terror would never fully fade. But science was advancing in ways that would eventually bring justice to even the coldest cases. DNA technology was evolving at a rapid pace, and new techniques were being developed that could extract usable genetic profiles from evidence samples that had previously been considered too degraded or contaminated to analyze. The breakthrough that would finally unmask Joseph DeAngelo would come not from traditional police work, but from the intersection of advanced forensic science and the growing field of genetic genealogy. The evidence that investigators had carefully preserved for decades would finally yield the answers that had eluded them for so long. In 0062, a retired investigator named Paul Holes was working late in his laboratory at the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office, surrounded by boxes of evidence from decades-old unsolved cases. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he carefully examined DNA samples that had been collected from crime scenes throughout California during the 1970s and 1980s. Holes had dedicated much of his career to what many considered impossible cases, crimes where traditional investigative methods had been exhausted and the trail had gone completely cold. But he possessed something that separated him from other investigators, an unwavering belief that science would eventually provide answers to even the most perplexing mysteries. The samples he was studying that night had been collected from the East Area Rapist attacks in Sacramento and the original Night Stalker murders in Southern California. For years, forensic analysts had suspected these crimes were technology-connected, but they hadn't existed to prove it definitively. The DNA samples were degraded, contaminated by decades of storage, and contained genetic material from multiple sources. But advances in DNA analysis were occurring at an unprecedented rate. New techniques were being developed that could extract usable genetic profiles from evidence that had previously been considered worthless. Computer databases were being created that could compare DNA samples across jurisdictions and time periods, potentially linking crimes that had never been connected before. As Holes worked through the night, running sample after sample through increasingly sophisticated analysis equipment, he began to see patterns emerging from the genetic data. The same unknown male DNA profile was appearing in evidence from crimes committed hundreds of miles apart and spanning more than a decade. The breakthrough came at 3:17 in the morning, when the computer finally generated a complete genetic profile that matched evidence from 12 different crime scenes across California. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker weren't just similar criminals operating in different areas. They were the same person. The revelation sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities across the state. Investigators who had worked these cases for decades suddenly realized they had been hunting one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The scope of the crimes was staggering. Over 50 sexual assaults and 12 confirmed murders, with additional crimes likely remaining undiscovered. But having a DNA profile was only the first step. The genetic information had been compared against every database available to law enforcement, from convicted felons to military personnel to government employees. No matches were found anywhere. The killer's DNA existed in evidence samples, but his identity remained as mysterious as ever. The investigation entered a new phase that would last for over a decade. Cold case investigators across California began re-examining every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every potential suspect who had ever been considered in connection with the crimes. The combined cases were officially linked under a new designation, the Golden State Killer. On April 24, 2018, nearly 42 years after the first confirmed East Area Rapist attack, Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested at his home in Citrus Heights, California. The breakthrough had come through genetic genealogy, a revolutionary technique that compared the killer's DNA to public genealogy databases, tracing family connections back through generations until investigators could identify their suspect. The man who emerged from his modest suburban home that morning looked nothing like the athletic predator who had terrorized California for over a decade. At 72 years old, DeAngelo was frail, gray-haired, walking with the careful steps of someone whose body had been betrayed by time. His neighbors described him as a cranky old man who yelled at children and obsessed over his lawn. They had no idea they had been living next door to one of America's most notorious serial killers. The arrest sent shockwaves through communities that had never forgotten the terror of those dark years. Survivors who had carried their trauma for decades suddenly had a face to attach to their nightmares. Families of murder victims finally had answers to questions that had haunted them for nearly half a century. The phantom who had moved through their neighborhoods like smoke had finally been given form, substance, accountability. On June 29, 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of murder and numerous other charges, receiving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. In court, he was forced to listen as victim after victim described the devastation he had wrought, the lives he had destroyed, the communities he had poisoned with fear. The man who had once derived pleasure from the terror of others sat silently as his own reckoning unfolded. The Golden State Killer case stands as a testament to the persistence of investigators who never gave up hope, the advancement of science in service of justice, and the enduring strength of survivors who refuse to let evil have the final word. But perhaps most importantly, it serves as a chilling reminder that monsters don't always look the part. Sometimes they wear badges, live in quiet neighborhoods, and hide their darkness behind the very institutions designed to protect us. The shadows that once held such terror have finally been illuminated, and the phantom that haunted California for so long has been revealed for what he truly was. Not a supernatural force, but a man whose choices led him down the darkest possible path. Justice may have been delayed, but it was not denied, and in the end, that makes all the difference in the world. Sleep well tonight, knowing that some mysteries do eventually find their answers, and that even the coldest cases can still burn bright with the fire of truth.